our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for staying. It's been a really inspiring day. Good evening to you all in person in this room and online. To introduce myself again, for those who missed the previous panel, my name is Broderick Chow. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I was born on unceded land, and I grew up as a settler of immigrant parents on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, or Vancouver, Canada. I'm an East and Southeast Asian man of mixed Chinese and Filipino heritage, and my father comes from Xiamen in southern China. By way of a refugee childhood in Hong Kong after the Second World War. On my mother's side, I'm Filipino from Manila. So this is really a talk that is somewhere between a talk and performance, but it's about stories and telling stories about the feeling of doing anti-racism work and about, I suppose, the phenomenology of what it is to transform our institutions. My talk today is about how we are addressed as the subjects and agents of change. It's also about how we, as minoritized people, racialized, queer, marginalized, dispossessed, and those who now identify as the global majority, how we address others to make change. I'm thankful to Kim for providing a definition of the global majority, and I'd like to add a kind of precursor in the African-American writer W.E. Du Bois's notion of the dark proletariat, what he called the dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africa, in the West Indies and Central America and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry. So this talk starts in 2020, when many people were addressed as subjects of transformation. So many calls were shouted into the world, hopeful and raging performatives into the vast sphere of discourse. I was new at that time at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and I had sole, or at least leadership responsibility for equality, diversity, and inclusion at Central, which was an institution in the midst of a fresh acknowledgement of institutional racism. And at that time, I wondered if these calls were ever heard. This experience was disorienting. It was shattering in more than one sense. So this text brings together a number of pieces of writing over the last 3 years of attempting to reorient myself, to pull myself together. Not only formal academic writing, but diary entries, voice notes, words written to others on WhatsApp or Telegram. So at its heart, it's about different levels of discourse, of address and listening and anti-racist practice. It's about the disjuncture between the intimate, interpersonal, and the institutional. Which is to say, I suppose, this talk is about language itself. It's about the real intimacy of language between friends and the feigned intimacy of the corporate "we hear you." About the uncertain space between languages and the work of translation. So in thinking about language, I want to mark right now, for those who don't know me, the shifts in my speech and accent as this talk progresses. From this, which is, I would say, a fairly Western Canadian vernacular, to something approaching Filipino, which is not the accent of my mother tongue, but it's the accent of how I speak to my mother. So, in the summer of 2020, a group of scholars of the global majority met for the first conversation that would lead to the formation of a collective of Black and global majority scholars in theater, dance, and performance studies in the UK called Revolution or Nothing, and the creation of an open letter to the field which was entitled White Colleague Listen. This was named after Hazel V. Carby's 1982 article, White Woman Listen, Black Feminism and the Boundaries of Sisterhood. It was the first year of the pandemic. We met on Zoom and Google Docs. It was the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in our own field, what we then began calling the drama school anti-racism movement. Many of us had spent hours, days even, in institutional meetings where responses to the stories of global majority students and action plans arising for these were crafted. It's useful for those colleagues in this room who identify as white to pause and imagine what this felt like at the time. Sitting in Zoom spaces of mainly white faces, while anti-racism action plans and inclusive pedagogy were discussed in the same breath as reputational damage and de-escalation. All the while, the experiences of hundreds, thousands of students rang in our ears and reminded us of our own. At the time, we wrote about how theater, dance, and performance studies are underpinned and built on values that have historically privileged colonial knowledge systems. We wrote about how our disciplines are built on colonial principles of extraction from global majority colleagues, the appropriation of minoritarian scholarship, the erasure of global majority voices from research and scholarship on race and racism undertaken by white colleagues. We were 50 and more voices, a collective that took the name Revolution or Nothing. We wrote a list of testimonies, acts of everyday racism we had experienced in our institutions and in the field. It stretched to over 4,000 words. We signed our names. We put it on the open source publication platform Medium. We drafted an announcement to Drama HE, the email listserv for our fields, and we pressed send. Now, the problem with open letters is that they don't really invite a response. This was true of this letter, White Colleague Listen, as it was true of the many open letters written by Black and global majority former students in the drama school anti-racism movement. It was also true of letters like We See You, White American Theater in the US. Or rather, these open letters are met with a flurry of the wrong sort of response, the institutional response. Each institution wrote and crafted an anti-racism action plan that apologized for and promised to challenge institutional racism. And I'm sure most colleagues in the room will recognize this, if not from the perspective of race and racism, then from the perspective of violence and bullying and boundaries that we've heard all through the day today. The last 2 years have been spent working against institutional racism, anti-racism shifting into institutional discourses of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And at my institution, the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, this action plan suddenly became my responsibility, which is a nearly Kafkaesque plot twist in hindsight. So at first, I tried to do this in a dispassionate way. I used my tools as a researcher. I gathered all the testimonies received from global majority former students at Central. I gathered data from listening sessions I held with current students, and I used thematic analysis, and I wrote a qualitative report. From these testimonies, I thought we could see how oppression and coloniality appeared in our institution through various themes. From this starting point, we, meaning the institution, could see the issues in the cold light of day and address them through positive actions. The work wasn't really different in kind to the work going on in so many institutions during this time after the summer of 2020, listening sessions, listening testimonies, developing action plans. Now, in retrospect, does it seem hopelessly naive to you? I think anti-racism and EDI action plans have an important role to play. They mark a promise. An institutional promise, sure, but a mobilization towards a goal. The problem is that, of course, it's only part of the work. The promise itself cannot identify what I have previously called the blank space of the promise, the shared goals that decolonization or anti-racism will work towards. And this is just the old Marxist problem of praxis, isn't it? Our work towards revolution will be uncertain because our imagination of what revolution will be is limited by the historical horizon of the present moment. It takes courage to take that unknown step, something institutions are not known for. I didn't really expect the resistance I'd encounter, but my body was trained for resistance, so I resisted. I was dealing with my own shit at the time. The enormous rise of racial violence against Asians in Britain, the US, Europe, and Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic, honestly, I was falling apart. But I pushed, I pulled, I did the heavy lifting, but the toll on me of doing this work began to add up. I kept pushing a program of work towards inclusive pedagogy, but I soon found that those who resisted the work most, or maybe just resisted me, were those who were most invested in the paradigm already of decolonizing. Everyone was doing so much already. Again and again, the conversation was diverted to what others were doing wrong. I shared feedback to colleagues from students, not crucially a complaint, but a concern, a legitimate concern. And the next day, I received a long formal email with my manager copied in about how I didn't understand their program, their course, their expertise. They were experts in these issues, but of course, I'd lived them. Every month, I was berated by demands from a white colleague to update her on the progress towards the anti-racism action plan from the newsletter. But who was reading the newsletter? The effect of this was an embodied disorientation, a pull from multiple angles, a distraction. As Kim brought up earlier, Toni Morrison says that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your very reason for being. I was spinning off my axis a manifestation of the institutional phenomenology of whiteness that kept reminding me, according to Sarah Ahmed, of my queer disorientation in reference to the mainstream. But there are a few others in a more powerful position to change the institution than me, so I kept going. My team and I rolled out mandatory anti-racism training, which was a hugely important development for Central. It featured training on both microaggressions and allyship, and then in May of 2021, 6 East Asian women were murdered by a white man in Atlanta, and I experienced some of the most horrific microaggressions from the newsletter woman and a stunning lack of allyship from everyone else. I should have anticipated this. We wrote about it in White Colleague Listen. When responsibility is passed on to an institution, we said it absolves the responsibility, culpability, and complicity of individuals in perpetuating racist power structures, but it is individuals who make up institutions. The phrase institutional racism was constantly in use during this time, but sometimes it seems like there's no actual racism, only institutional racism. Who made the bad institution? Who made the bad system? Institutions say, we hear you, but I'm not sure the individuals in the institution hear themselves addressed. Anti-racism training doesn't do anything if everyone hears themselves out of it. I wondered if we'd just continue like this, writing action plans towards an endlessly deferred future, and then this summer, 2 transformative things happened. Firstly, White Colleague Listen received a reply from a white colleague. This was not in the form of an open letter, nor a personal interaction, nor an action plan. It was an article in the journal Performance Philosophy by my friend and colleague Giulia Palladini, a white, female, migrant scholar of Italian heritage, formerly senior lecturer in the now destroyed Department of Theater and Performance at Roehampton University, a victim of the systematic defunding of tertiary education, the neoliberalization of educational institutions, and the cutting of departments. It can be disorienting and delightful to recognize your words through another. Palladini responds directly to White Colleague Listen, summarizing nearly 9,000 words of that letter into an elegant argument. She says, the values underpinning our fields that have historically privileged colonial knowledge systems nourish this systemic racism that endures in contemporary academia, not only by enabling everyday interactions that continuously produce and make those markers of difference appear, but profoundly characterize the very notion of difference produced, taught, and circulated in the academic context. Furthermore, Palladini points to something intrinsic in the open letter that none of the institutional responses had really understood. She says, the reader is addressed as a singularity. It invites me to be part of this conversation, or else it constructs a possibility of imagination in which I, in fact, am that white colleague addressed in the letter in her singularity and her difference, as equivalent and not as identical to all other colleagues working in the field of theater and performance in the UK. Then Julia brings together two other elements: her translation of the radical queer indigenous Bolivian Chilean writer, performer, activist Pedro Lemebel, and her work in the classroom, to think through the nearly impossible stakes of white colleague listen, an impossible horizon that stretches from epistemology to individual lived experience. Writing on Lemebel, she says, "It is through an embodied memory that a specific account of history always emerges. It is through the individual's body and experience that collective experience can not only be recognized, but actively constituted, that it can be named according to language exceeding the code that is given to it for articulating itself." To say it otherwise, in the process of translation, which is to say in teaching, the space of a knowing passing from one to another, the stakes are no less than re-articulating the very knowledge systems that produce difference or diversity, the very difference that is experienced, that I experience at the level of the body. I saw that Julia posted this article on Facebook. I downloaded it and I saved it for later reading. I was in the midst of a second transformative thing this summer. I was course leader and director of the New Earth Performers Academy, which was a partnership with Central and New Earth Theatre, a company dedicated to work by and for East and Southeast Asians, or ECs, in the UK. The Academy is a 2-week intensive training offered for free to EC artists. I could not have prepared for how transformative and life-affirming this experience would be. We found ourselves, all of us for the first time, in an artistic community of enormously diverse individuals who nonetheless share a common difference, at least in terms of how this difference is recognized by the rest of the world, or articulated by institutions, epistemologies, and the white gaze. We are those who tick Chinese and other on diversity forums in the UK because there is no other official box for us to tick. For me, this was a profound period of unlearning, re-articulating the way difference operates in both theater and performance, and in me. Reflecting on the New Earth Academy in the second part of this talk, I now wish to offer my response to Julia Palladini's reply, which in turn is my own reflection on White Colleague Listen. I've chosen not to address it to Julia, my friend and colleague, nor to any of you in the room today. This is actually a letter to one of my Academy students, a 20-year-old man who is now a student on an acting course at the institution at which I am a senior leader for responsibility for EDI. It's also addressed to all of my students and also to those who are yet to arrive and those who may not. Dear brother, I've only known you a few months, and yet I've known you a lifetime. I was your teacher only recently on a project in space where, for the first time, we felt seen. You are Burmese, but you could also be Filipino, Malaysian, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Singaporean, Taiwanese, and all the diasporic variations too. You are my brother, you are my sister, my sibling, my cousin, my friend. You are those who are yet to arrive and those who may not. Do you remember I said to you that I was your tito, your uncle, now? You've just started 3 years in the college where I am, in theory, in charge of ensuring that you are seen, you are listened to, there is a space for you. I am scared of writing this because I don't know for sure that I can make that happen. I am scared because after you, there are those who are yet to arrive and those who may not, those who never will. Julia Palladini asks, how to describe the sea to a child who has never seen it? How do you do so for a child who will likely never see it? Another question forms, hangs in the air, implicit in her words. How do we describe something that we want, a decolonized university that does not yet exist? How do we imagine something that in the present day seems so utterly unlikely to happen? How can we resist what Palladini calls the logic of scarcity, that logic which impinges upon both what is named and produced as reality, and also the possible imagination that stems from this reality? I do not know how to describe the space that you will encounter, even though it is my space, the institution that I have worked so hard to fix and reorder and change. I do not know what it is you will encounter. If anyone hurts you, I will fuck them up, right, Pare? But I cannot promise you a safe space. Safe space naman. Ano ibig sabihin yon? Anak, there are some things that you should know. I cannot tell you the number of hours I have sat listening to students who share a lived experience with me and you, something we are now calling being part of the global majority. They tell me about not being seen, of being tokenized, of being accused of exaggerating their trauma, of being told that the racist comment from a guest artist isn't really a big deal, of being misgendered, of being accused of weaponizing their identity, of being called difficult, of being afraid of being called difficult. I've listened and they tell me they feel heard and listened to, and then I go to my white colleagues, they're teachers, and they hear but they do not listen. Or, I don't know, maybe they just hear something different. It's rarely outright denial, but sometimes those sympathetic nods are even worse. There will be many, many times when you don't feel seen. Honestly, it will be most of the time. I'm sure of this because I don't feel seen either. Sometimes it feels like what the Asian American poet Kathy Park Hong describes in her book Minor Feelings. She said, "For as long as I could remember, I have struggled to prove myself into existence. I, the modern-day scrivener, working 5 times as hard as others, and still I saw my hand dissolve, and then my arm." This is like so accurate, Pare. Like I fell apart when I read it. Sometimes I just sit in meetings and I feel my body disappear. There are times over the last 2 years when it was really bad. I have so much to tell you that I must keep silent because I have accepted apologies, because it wasn't intentional, but because this letter is addressed to you and to you alone, I will tell you. So here goes. The day after 6 Asian women were murdered by a white man in Atlanta, Georgia, I wanted to reach out to you. I wanted our colleagues to listen. I was told by a close colleague, a white woman, that we should focus on the murder of the white woman in Clapham Common instead in the first instance. I was told that FYI, the police have said that the motivation of the crime was still not known. I was told that the murderer had a bad day. And I was told that my colleague nonetheless recognized intersectionality. What did I do? I wrote a polite and firm email, and I told my colleague that what she said was racist. I told her about my shadow of deep grief and wild anger. I told her that while I have sisters, cousins, and friends who look just like the 6 East Asian women murdered by a white man, that day no one at all had reached out to me. I told her of the everyday racism I experience and witness against people in my community, which has increased exponentially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And yet, I said, I know it was not your intention. And yet, I chose to protect her feelings. You and me, we are only supposed to show certain feelings in institutional spaces. Di ba, kapatid? We are meant to only show positive feelings, to swallow bitterness, to smile through it, to accept that allies are doing their best even though there is so much more to be done. We are supposed to be generous, to say nothing, to have a conversation later that never transpires because having that conversation, that actual human conversation, can only happen after 5 p.m. And then why do I want to spend my evening having it? We're supposed to be built for this, aren't we? Swallowing bitterness is a virtue for people like us, or so the stereotype goes. As Keela Schuler points out, the perception of East Asian people as mechanical and lacking in emotional development served Western imperialist interests, since these qualities marked us as easily moved by others, particularly our employers. The stereotype of a robotic, unfeeling, servile mass of Asians motivated great acts of violence from white workers, such as the Chinese massacre of 1871, to the shootings of 6 Chinese and Korean women in Atlanta, to the almost daily acts of violence against EC people during COVID. And then, it also manifests in those slights and offhand comments that force us to remember that the imperial world does not see us as fully human. In April last year, just a month after the Atlanta killings, the Irish photographer Matt Lawfrey was featured in Vice magazine for his project My Colorful Past. In it, he colorizes and edits historical black and white photographs. The newest incarnation of this project represented photographs of prisoners from Tuol Sleng prison in Cambodia, where it is estimated 18,000 prisoners were tortured and killed by the Khmer Rouge. Without the consent of family members or Cambodian community organizations, Lawfrey photoshopped smiles onto their faces. With his Wacom tablet and software package, he pulled up the corners of the eyes and lips of 00721, an unnamed and unknown boy or man who was never identified and whose body was never found. He made the skin golden brown, and he guessed at the color of the t-shirt, I suppose. He did it, he says, to humanize the tragedy. The outcry, of course, was swift and immediate and included criticism from the Cambodian Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts, the National Cambodian Heritage and Killing Fields Museum. But the damage of the revelation was already done. He wanted to humanize the tragedy because the expressionless Asian face could not be seen as human. The only way to humanize the tragedy is to show a little feeling, but just so long as it's a positive one. This is what Kathy Park Hong means by minor feelings. They're the friction of the gears grinding, of feelings being kept in place. They're the static of trying to express and being called expressionless. She says minor feelings are also the emotions we are accused of saving when we decide to be difficult. In other words, when we decide to be honest. When minor feelings are finally externalized, they're interpreted as hostile, ungrateful, jealous, depressing, belligerent, affects ascribed to racialized behavior that whites consider out of line. Well, I don't know about you, bro, but we don't get out of line very often. Because, see, our parents were immigrants because they sacrificed, because they starved back home, and they worked so hard because. I mean, it's never been in my nature to minimize anything. My late father was terrible at swallowing bitterness, and so am I. But I don't know, sometimes it's not my choice, right? Sahar Ahmed talks about how institutional spaces are shaped by the proximity of some bodies and not others. White bodies gather and cohere to form the edges of such spaces. I mean, this phenomenology is such a powerful thing. How can we expect to be listened to if our colleagues cannot even see the guy in the corner whose body is disappearing before their eyes? And yet, even as our bodies disappear, we hear a clamor of allyship around us. The sociologist Deborah Brewis conducted a research project where she listened in on spaces where EDI was discussed. She outlined the speech acts through which white supremacy maintained its power in higher education institutions. So she called this one of announcing, like, as a white person, as a white ally, she called this disclaiming. It keeps all of us, not just East and Southeast Asians, but everyone in the global majority from giving voice to those minor feelings. In disclaiming your whiteness, your allyship, telling us there is more to be done, I lose my opportunity to give voice to small affects of loss or grief or rage. I can't get at the wound because there is a dog cone of allyship in the way. So you might wonder how I resolved that situation with my white colleague. I eventually bandaged over the microaggressions of my colleague in the wake of a white man's bad day in a facilitated conversation where I more than earned my salary through an honest day's emotional labor. And honest to God, I swear my former line manager was responding to his emails during it. Here's the difficult problem. Minor feelings are the result of things beyond our control. The colonial rupture of the 16th century, Western imperialism, epistemological violence, institutional and systemic racism, but it is our individual bodies that experience them. That is the reality and one of the greatest barriers to any institutional mission. And I don't think the answer is just doing away with EDI or changing our language. The work is deeper, right? It takes bravery and it takes humility. It will destabilize us and make us interrogate the very idea of teaching and learning. Do you remember how quickly our community formed at New Earth Academy this summer? We only had 2 intense weeks together, but even at the end of day 1, it was like we'd known each other forever. At first, we thought it was because we all shared the same experiences, that we shared an identity. You said it was those simple moments like being able to Asian squat freely without it being a thing, or just even knowing what the other person is talking about when we shared stories about food or childhoods. You and I felt validated in our embodied realities and our cultures. We were no longer the disappearing body in the corner. And, of course, this made us visible in our difference, because suddenly we could not help but be seen and heard. Pedro Lemebel says that a minority is a multitude before a sole man with weapons. So, were we threatening in the white space of a royal institution? I mean, I don't know for sure, but do you remember how one afternoon you came in and you told me that at lunchtime, a white student from another summer school had approached a small group of you and said a microaggression? She said, "Where are you from? Your English is so good." What a cliche, diba? At the time, you laughed, you smoothed it over, you continued to engage with her. And we laughed in the room at how predictable it all was. And then, the next morning we unpacked it all. We held space for our minor feelings, our music in a minor key, which was no longer so minor at all. And perhaps this is why it felt so joyful, because ultimately, we do not share the same identity even if we share a queer form of kinship. We are a multitude of ethnicities: Filipino, Malaysian, Burmese, Taiwanese, Japanese, Korean, Singaporean. We are not the same in our multiplicity of gender identifications or sexualities or disabilities, but we held space for our feelings, minor, uncomfortable, joyful, and otherwise, which meant that something else could happen. An act of translation that enabled us to bridge the distance between your lived experience and mine that we might otherwise call learning. So isn't this ultimately what we want a decolonized pedagogy to do? Isn't all EDI just an act of translation? But one that in doing so makes us question the very logic of alterity that marks us as different in the first place. And this is what Julia Palladini so eloquently summarizes in her response to White Colleague Listen. She calls teaching an act of translation that stages an act of the incessant weaving of a social fabric into language, an act that by its own quality cannot but rip the language off and leave a certain work of mending to be done by the reader, the listener, the translator. This, she says, is a vital step to turn the classroom into a space where the mind cultivates a different habit to think one's own space of repair and responsibility. It's scary work, though, because remember, in Spanish, the word for language is lenguaje, 2 letters away from lengua, or tongue, and once we rip that thing off, we don't know how we will speak. But once we jump into that unknown space, the space of epistemological uncertainty, we see that, to quote Palladini, difference only exists because it is captured in discourse as such, which is not to say that that violence of that discourse does not matter or hurt. It does. So perhaps we, or I, need to reorient myself in relation to you, my brother, my friend, those who are yet to arrive and those who are not. My ethical act is to rethink what it means to teach and instead consider teaching with, learning with, what Olivia Michiko Gagnon calls a pedagogy of accompaniment. This means I must decenter myself, worrying less about whether you are achieving this or that skill, but instead create the conditions for accompanying you, my student, every student, on your journey towards an encounter with a subject, a play, a text, a piece of choreography. Another way of putting this is care, which is not really the same as keeping you safe. It's more like being your friend. It's more like Gayatri Spivak's idea of epistemological care, which is itself produced by the condition of violence and therefore has nothing benevolent to it. A declaration of unrest, at the very least a conscious decision to bring translation outside the territory of individual craft and make it a shared collective task. It's a work of both engendering and resisting the language of difference through which one day we may learn to be done with the very idea of sameness. So, compare, I want to end this letter with a random cuento. When I saw those photographs of the unnamed Cambodian victims of Tuol Sleng, I thought of these sepia-toned images in my family's archive, pasted in albums that my mother and I leafed through in the wake of my father's death. So this is a photo of my grandmothers, my mother's mother and my father's mother as girls. They'd been school friends as children long before my mother and father even met or were born. On the left, Maximina Sequeiro Yu, a Filipina-Chinese girl sent away to boarding school in Xiamen, China. On the right, Cho Kim Chu, a young Chinese woman who gave my father his large eyes and strong nose. I never knew either of them. Both women were simply ama in my imagination. How different their lives would be only a few years after this photograph was taken. How violent the winds of coloniality would be, shattering windows and blowing doors closed for both. Cho Kim Chu, her husband, imprisoned, raising 7 children, including my father, in an occupied city as bombs dropped upon the beaches of Gulangyu Island. A bold and defiant woman, she never got along with the family into which she was married. Because my father was a middle child, a problem child, gifted and clever, but possessed of a stubbornness and devilish mischief that made him her singular vexation, she gave him her last name. She was a staunch Maoist, a Marxist, and when land reform was announced in China, she stood at the top of the steps and she declared to her family, "You told me I cursed this family, and now I finally have." They fled as refugees to Hong Kong during the war. They often went hungry and the children worked. I wonder if my Lola Maximina would ever think of her childhood friend when she was grown up and married to Vicente Veloso Yap and raising her 7 children in a large compound in Makati, Manila. Children so spoiled the yayas would all make them separate meals for dinner. Perhaps not. Until in the early 1970s, they reconnected, just as the Veloso Yap family was preparing to leave Manila for Canada during the imposition of martial law by the authoritarian government of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. She was over 60 by this time, suddenly faced with living in a new country whose language she spoke due to American colonialism, but whose culture she knew little about. What would it be like in Vancouver? They knew no one there other than, well, by chance, the wandering, wayward middle son of her childhood school friend, who then met and fell in love with her youngest daughter. I wonder what would happen if a photographer glanced upon this picture of 2 East and Southeast Asian women, unsmiling, dressed in cheongsam. What would my white colleagues think? Would they think they were being too expressionless? Would they want them to smile, to show a little feeling? Would they understand their stories? What do I need to do to bridge the gap between my story and theirs, and our story and yours and those of our hopefully ever-expanding circle? Because we all have a story like this, don't we? Recognizable and yet indescribably different. I mean, you do, and you, and you, and you, my brother, my friends, those who are yet to arrive and those who may not. P.S. By the way, did you know in Tagalog there is a word that contains I and you and doesn't mean we? Kita. Turuan kita, I teach you. Tulungan kita, I help you. Mahal kita. From your teacher, your tito, your kuya, your aya, your friend, Broderick. Thank you.
Broderick Cho, and I think we have some time for a short session of questions, if it's all right with you. And my idea is that I would ask you one question, and then I would ask you to take the voice and ask your questions. And my question would be like, actually, it's the most important thing for me. What is supportive? How can we support you? What is support? It's like, if you would say one thing, what is supportive and what maybe is the opposite of what is supportive, of what you told us just a moment ago?
I think what I ultimately want this talk to achieve is something that I think of a lot about myself with regards to how I now approach the classroom, how I now approach my students, and not just students of East and Southeast Asian heritage, but all my students, and thinking about the fact that I need to decenter myself from the conversation, to decenter myself as the expert, as the person in charge, which isn't the same thing as giving up responsibility for holding a space, but to think differently about what my place is in the work. And I suppose what support looks like is for all colleagues, I suppose, to do that work for themselves, about thinking about how everyone can decenter themselves from the conversation in order to let that space open up where translation happens. That, I think, is so important now. Because if this talk or performance is in two parts, that first part is really about like the kind of psychic impact of performative work, I suppose, towards inclusion. It's like if everybody is like on the same page and performing that they're on the same page, and nothing is changing, then that is the thing that takes the toll on the people who are trying to provoke change. So if we can support that work, it really is about doing that together, to step outside the circle again for ourselves and to decenter ourselves from the conversation, and then to think differently about the way that we teach. And I think that if there's one thing, it's like just have the bravery to do that. That's what I think, that we all need to have that bravery to do that thing. And it's so hard for us as academics because we spend our lives like developing this expertise, developing, a research profile, an artistic profile, and so on. And it's like, how do you let go of that? And so much of that is going to be about letting go of the ego, of course. But like that's, for me, just such a necessary step for something else, something new to take place and happen.
Thank you. So I'll follow your advice and decenter myself, and I would like to pass the microphone to your questions.
Hi, hello, my name is Zosia. I have a very simple question, because you mentioned a poem, even though I work harder and longer, I see my arm disappears. Could you repeat the artist and the title, please?
So her name is Kathy with a C, Kathy Park Hong. She's a Korean-American poet. The book is not necessarily a book of poetry, but it's kind of essays in this style, which is... It was so inspirational to me when I read it because, and the book is called Minor Feelings, by the way. And I sort of picked, it came out, I think, in the first year of the pandemic, and I sort of read it as this kind of incredible moment of expressing, so many of the things that we as Asian people in the West feel, and it was like a real comfort during that time because there was nobody else doing that writing from a kind of phenomenological perspective about experience. It was always like a kind of historical or sociological, and she was really writing these deeply embodied essays about that moment of that arm and the hand disappearing. It was is gorgeous to me, but it's so resonant. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it. It's very much from the Asian American perspective. I'm not Asian American, I'm Asian Canadian, but it was really applicable to lots of different diasporic communities.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm from the Academy of Theatre and Dance in Amsterdam. But I grew up in Germany, and something that happened during 2020 and in the following years in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement was, I'm not sure if appropriation is the right word, but a sort of a mistranslation from a US-American context towards specific situated German circumstances, which are necessarily different. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that, how you experienced that, especially as an Asian Canadian person, then being in London.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, because I do think that often in British discourses around race and racism, we do need to have like specific situated historical knowledge of the specifics about, you know, what the history of that country is. And if we're just importing concepts from a US perspective, number one, I think that that's like a slight, you know, it can be another form of US like exceptionalism and imperialism even, because it like centers the US, right? But also it allows for like a get out for, you know, for British people, but it was just like, oh, it's not the same thing as in America. And I think that, I think that we need to develop specific perspectives on race and racism from and we need to think intersectionally, of course, and we need to read widely and through, you know, a wide variety of race scholars. But I'm very careful in my work to, you know, I'm specifically speaking about my experiences here, and I'm speaking about the experiences of people who share my positionality in certain ways, at least in terms of racialization. And I'm careful to think about that in a specific way, that anti-Asian racism has a specific history. And it has a specific history in Britain, has a specific history in Canada and in the US. And we need to have those concepts, and in doing so, but we need to read widely, so we need to reckon with, for example, anti-blackness in Asian communities and colorism in Asian communities, which is a huge thing too, you know, and I know that, you know, being a Chinese and Filipino person, like that is something that has been very prevalent through my life as well. So I think that a real like kind of diversity of viewpoints, as opposed to like just an imposition of certain perspectives on race and racism is incredibly important. And it will be up to every particular kind of community to do that work for themselves. So, and I really hear that about the German context. And you know, one of my colleagues who I edit CTR Contemporary Theatre Review Interventions with is Azadeh Sharifi, who works on a lot of Black German histories, and I think that, you know, she is thinking about the specific history of Germany and Black people and Blackness in Germany, as opposed to just you know, thinking about imposing certain perspectives from overseas.
Okay, so I think that Simon was first, and I will follow you in a moment.
Thank you for this beautiful talk. I wanted to hear you more talking about that desire to teach with and learn with. If you also could maybe tell a bit more about that pedagogy of contingency. I'm curious to learn more. Like, this is also like some questions that we're having in this practical research in Amsterdam. Also, like, who's doing the teaching, who is doing the learning, how to decentralize knowledges and share agencies. and so on.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about that, so is pedagogy of accompaniment is what Olivia Michiko-Gagnon talks about, of like learning with, and in some ways it's not radical, because if you think about pedagogy itself as like the original meaning of it is like the person who accompanies the child to school as opposed to the actual teacher. When it, like, to be very practical about it, what was really interesting about this process over last summer was how destabilized I was in terms of thinking about, well, what is it to train a culturally conscious actor training? You know, I have my tools from my own perspective, my own training, and then I needed to go into this group where we couldn't ignore the elephant in the room, that all of these perspectives just came from white theater makers and artists. And then the shifting and changing on a day-to-day basis, that all of the lesson planning that I did had to go out the window. And it really had to kind of start with really thinking and taking seriously their positionalities in the space. And that was very scary at the time, but it was also really exhilarating. And I think that the thing that I'm now really thinking about is how cultural consciousness, or at least like consciousness of one's own positionality and relations to others, has to be like, is a starting point of any sort of process of acting and performance. And I'm obviously not the first person to think about this. I'm inspired by Christine Landon Smith in particular, talks about like intra-cultural actor training. And that process of knowledge of the self, softening, meeting the circumstances, and transformation. And that's very exciting because it's not super prescriptive, but that first stage is really important of like, okay, so we need to do a lot of work about who are we in this space, who are we to each other. And so that pedagogy of accompaniment, what it felt like was that I had nothing. Like that I wasn't even a teacher anymore, that I was like, God knows what I was doing. But now I think that I'm much more kind of confident in knowing that it's so much about facilitating and creating a space where that encounter lives and happens.
Hi, thank you. I don't know if you'll want to do this, and it's okay if you don't. But the thing that really stayed with me and really resonated from what you shared was the disappearing, the body disappearing, and how like that almost becomes a normal state, so that to recognize something different feels really important and really big. Like, what do we do with that? And then I guess I'm thinking about being in a collective space and having permission to name affects before we know what we're naming, before we can name why those things are happening or what they are. And then I'm really struck by the speed with which we moved from this talk, performance, sharing, into the questions and the answers and the articulacy. And I guess I'm curious if you want to, of you naming the affect, naming affect. Like, what's going on for you right now? And you may not want to go into that space because it's maybe quite vulnerable, but
it's no, I actually really appreciate that, because I think that that's what this is about, actually. And I think what has been interesting about this is not the first time that I've spoken this out loud. It's not the first time I've given this performance, and I've also given it in some different contexts as well, where it's not necessarily like theater and performance people, like once in a research context, there are bits and pieces of this that have been given in other online contexts, and I think that every time the affect is different. Like ultimately, I'm an actor, right? Like that's how I started, and like every time I do this, like I feel that deeply, and I think about my own experiences of working with text and letting myself be hit by emotion and affect, and it's of course different when you're writing your own material, but I've been doing that for a long time too, you know. So I'm sort of really conscious about, like, it actually does feel a little bit like, you know, going through those same emotions again. But I think that the phenomenology of performing that is really important for what I'm doing with this. Like, I've like thought a lot about publishing this in performance philosophy, Laura, but I was like, and then I think about, like, well, how does it capture the performance of it? Like, I wonder how to do that. And so the affect of it, for me, coming out at the end of it, like telling that story about my family and my grandmothers, like, I feel quite joyful, quite meditative, and like it's very centering to talk about that, and to give life to a story that is, I think, really, really common for so many immigrant families. Like something like that. It sounds like super exceptional when you put it out there, but actually it's really, really common for so many people's families when they have immigrant childhoods and parents and so on. So it's quite exhilarating actually coming out of that, and then the space of the reflection on, like, turuan kita, mahal kita. Mahal kita means I love you, by the way. That's like a moment to pause before it ends. And that was really very intentionally placed in there to ensure that there's like a kind of tailing away of just in the way that a letter would be. And also to thank you, Rajni, for your work with Royona, which has been, you know, obviously Royona and I went and developed that. I think that so much of, so your work with listening and the work that it inspired in terms of these dialogic modes has been very inspirational to this, and levels of address. And, you know, obviously this is responding to Julia, and it's also responding to my student, and so that's been very important. So thank you for that.
Anyone else? Okay, so I would like to thank you once again for this evening, and for the chance to be here and to be present, because that's the word that was the most important for me. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.